Hello, my name is Peter Stute. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech University, and I'm hosting an online panel on the humanitarian crisis in Sudan, what can be done. For this panel, I'll be joined by Mohammed Qazelbash, who is the Country Director for Plan International Sudan, and Dr. Khalid Mustafa Madani, who's the Associate Professor of Political Science and Islamic Studies at McGill University, as well as Director of the Institute of Islamic Studies and Chair of the Africa Studies Program, and Kelly Clark, Advocacy and External Engagement Manager from World Vision Sudan. Just a quick disclaimer, some of the content here refers to acts of extreme violence, including sexual violence. So we begin the panel discussion, and you won't see my face for a bit because it didn't quite record properly, but you'll see it soon enough. And I begin by asking the question for Dr. Madani. Joined us. I will start with the most basic question, and maybe Khalid, you could lead us on this if you'd be kind enough. Too, and it's one of those ridiculously impossible to answer questions, but I'll ask it anyway, right? For those in the audience that aren't, as familiar with the conflict that's currently engulfing Sudan, could you perhaps briefly describe what you feel are the main causes of the current conflict between the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, and the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, and other groups in the region? Just a bit of a mini history, if you could be so kind.
Yes, of course, Peter. First of all, if you don't mind, in addition to the positions that you introduced me with here at McGill, I'm also from Sudan. And so by that kind of subject position, I want to thank you and everyone here for their attention. I want to thank, if you don't mind, Kelly Clark and Mr. Mohammed as well for all the work they're doing. I know that Sudanese have expressed that to you, whether it's in Sudan or Kenya, and your attention to this, Peter, is extremely important. It is, after all, the worst crisis, as the United Nations has said, in modern history in Africa. President Biden has also said the same thing recently at the United Nations, and there's a wide-scale consensus that with 10 million people that have suffered and been displaced, 2 million refugees, and of course half of the population, over 20 million, on the brink of starvation. There are no words really to describe the humanitarian crisis, but I know that Kelly and Mohammed will help us with that a little bit to tell us what's really going on. In terms of the causes, I usually begin by trying to alert people to the fact that this is a war between two generals, two military institutions, and not a civil war. I'm often asked why I say that, because the general description and understanding is that it's a civil war, by which we mean, of course, that it is one group of Sudanese against another. And one of the confounding things about this conflict, Peter, is that it really is between two military institutions and two generals and their allies who are basically fighting to amass a wealth and maintain power. And so, as intuitive and simplistic as that sounds, I think it's very important for people to understand that the majority of the Sudanese population, the civilian population, does not or is not taking sides or giving legitimacy to either side in this war, which I think is very confusing to people who are not regular followers of Sudan. And the reason for that is that they really are from the same root. In 1989, the beginning of the past regime of Omar Bashir, that was dominated by an Islamist fundamentalist civilian group with their allies in the army, overthrew a democratically elected government in the summer of 1989. Following that, there was a separation and partition of Sudan. Southern Sudan or South Sudan seceded in 2011. But for your listeners, I think, and for those watching us, I think the important critical juncture really is the war in Darfur in the early 2000s, 2003 to be exact. At that point, the former regime established what many of you probably would be familiar with, not only in the writings and journalistic accounts, but also, frankly, the fictional and even movie accounts of the Janjaweed in Darfur. That genocide, that ethnic cleansing, was really orchestrated, funded, and established, or rather prosecuted by the central government, the Islamist regime of Omar Bashir. It is at that point that they established the Janjaweed militia that enacted earth-scorched policies, killing over 200,000 civilians, displacing at least 1 million in Chad and elsewhere in the country to the west. It really is that beginning that helps explain the rapid support forces, the paramilitary militia that is wreaking havoc across Sudan. Over the years from 2000, roughly 2003 and 4 to 2006, you had the mutation of the Janjaweed into the rapid support forces, once again established and financed by the central government under the regime of Omar Bashir. So the two actors, or the two forces that are fighting each other, were allies for decades, for at least 20 years. Whether it was now the leader of the Rapid Support Forces militia, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, or the president, or the general rather of the Sudan Armed Forces, Abdel Fattah Burhan, they were partners not only in Darfur in the early 2000s, but throughout the period of the Omar Bashir regime. And so the question really is, for people who are confused by this, is what happened? How could two generals who had partnered not only to put down insurgencies in Darfur, but to kill thousands of young people who are fighting for democracy in Sudan, how did that kind of partnership fall apart leading to this war? And that really has to do with the revolution, the popular revolution of 2018, 2019 that overthrew the previous Islamist regime. And there was an effort, of course, as you know, to transfer the country or transition the country to a civilian democracy. That was something that both generals who are fighting each other now to the death, of course, were very much opposed because it undermined their economic and political interests. And in October of 2021, they decided to join forces and overthrow this effort, so to speak, and they waged a military coup in partnership with each other. The protest among Sudanese wanting democracy and freedoms continued all the way to December 2022, where there was a framework agreement under the auspices of the US and other international actors to return Sudan to a transition to democracy. There were two contentious issues, and I'm going to conclude here. I know I go on too long. Two contentious issues that I think explain the catalyst and the dynamics of this war for those unfamiliar with Sudan. The first one had to do with merging or the condition in the agreement to merge the two forces, to merge the paramilitary militia into the Sudan Armed Forces. That, of course, was rejected by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, essentially, because he understood that his very powerful, financially powerful, militarily powerful militia would lose power and lose prestige and legitimacy, or rather, sheer power and force. So that was rejected by him, and of course the Sudan Armed Forces wanted that merger in order to consolidate their military. But the other contentious issue had to do with the insistence on dismantling the apparatus of the state, or dismantling the financial kind of power of both the militia and the Sudan Armed Forces. That is to deal with the corruption that had led to the amassing of wealth through gold and other means to both the paramilitary militia and the Sudan Armed Forces. These two contentious issues were really the real reason that in April of 2023, you had the provocation, first on the part, frankly, of the Sudan Armed Forces and the Islamist allies or cadres at the top brass of the military. But of course, that quickly followed in terms of a reaction by Hamdan Dagalo and the Rapid Support Forces that really found themselves not only in a war to maintain power and wealth, but also a war in which both have calculated, as you can see by the humanitarian crisis, that from their perspective, this is a zero-sum calculation. That is, it is an existential war. It's not a regular war. It's not a civil war that we see in other African contexts and elsewhere. But for these two generals and their allies, whether it's in the militia or the upper ranks of the militia of the RSF, or the Islamist cadres, the militants in the top brass of the military, from their perspective, if they do not defeat the rival completely, not only will they lose their political economic power, but they will essentially evaporate from Sudanese politics and society. And I want people to understand the depth of that motivation, the calculation on both the sides and perspectives of these two generals, in order to understand how we have come to the worst humanitarian crisis and war that Africa has seen since independence, including, and I hate to say this, including what it looks like the Rwanda genocide in the early 1990s. I know that's a very dramatic thing to say, but given the domestic reasons for the conflict, and here I have to add the international actors, particularly the regional actors that have found opportunity to fuel one side against another, now we are having a colossal calamity in which you have these domestic factors I talked about and the interest of regional actors invested in perpetuating this war. So let me stop there. I hope that was not too, too confusing. I know it's depressing, but hopefully it's not too confusing.
No, not at all. And as an academic, your job is to go on too long, so don't worry.
Thank you.
It's wonderful. I was involved in the. I studied at great a great level at the Rwandan genocide, and if this is anything like that, then indeed, yeah, we're seeing a calamity unfold before our eyes. There's no question. Mohammed Kazalbash, did you have anything to add about what you think are the main causes of this war? And we will come back to the gold issue, by the way, Khalid, definitely. Yes, sir.
Well, first of all, thank you, Peter, and thank you all that are on the call, and greatly appreciate Canada taking this step forward in raising the issue around Sudan. And what Khalid said was very comprehensive, for sure, and greatly appreciate putting the picture in front of us. But there is the other factor that cannot be overlooked at any level, and the fact that this is actually, for me, a neglected crisis. People often say that this is forgotten. I beg to differ. It's been a deliberate action by the international community, the neighbors of Sudan, to basically neglect the systematic development of the crisis to what we are now witnessing as catastrophic. Nothing since 1984, those of us who remember 1984, have we seen a disaster of this scale. And the sad thing is that we haven't peaked yet. So the worst is still to come. In addition to the neglect by the international community, the fact of the matter is that, since the early 2000s and continuing onwards, I mean, this is a chain of events that have taken place and are linked in many ways with the individuals involved, but also with the mentality and the ethnic divisions that have perpetuated across Sudan, but not just Sudan, but across the entire region, and continue to do so. And one result was the splitting of the country and the creation of South Sudan, but similarly across the country itself had a very clear haves and have-nots. And parts of the country, like the south, like around the Nuba Mountains, the Darfurs, were very much economically neglected, and it was very much a Khartoum-driven country, with support particularly from the northern states, and the eastern states of Sudan. I mean, Sudan is is also what one needs to put in perspective. It's a massive country. It's 5 times the size of Germany and 8 times the size of Britain. So it's not a small country by any means, even after splitting off from South Sudan. So for me, it's a deliberate neglect of the suffering of the people of Sudan, and that has resulted in where we are right now. And out of the entire population, around about 50 million now, we've reached a level of over 21 million people who are at catastrophic levels of assistance, and most of them, unfortunately, are women and children. And the systematic abuse and rape of women and children across the country by all sides is a clear indication of the viciousness and the intensity of the crisis itself. And the Sudan crisis, yes, Sudan is the epicenter of the crisis, but we cannot and should not overlook the repercussions, the aftershocks of this crisis to the neighboring countries, whether it's South Sudan, Ethiopia, Chad, Central African Republic, Egypt, and even beyond the immediate borders of the country. And that really is one of the key areas that I think is being overlooked once again, that this is not just a Sudan-only crisis, but it goes far beyond the geographic and political boundaries of Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to that later in terms of the impact this is having on surrounding countries, but also the contributions perhaps being made by other countries. But Kelly, Kelly Clark, did you have anything you'd like to emphasize regarding the causes of?
Yeah, again, so those of you who aren't familiar, World Vision is a faith-based, community-based humanitarian organization that is in over 100 countries, and we've been in Sudan a long time. So we have the privilege of getting to partner with other humanitarian actors to try to get life-saving aid to those in need. And we're currently operational in South and East Darfur, South Kordofan, and Blue Nile, as well as Al Jazeera State. As a humanitarian organization, we don't have all of the insight into the causes of the conflict, but I also see in the chat the question about external actors. So maybe, Peter, I'll let you lead the conversation, but would be happy later to speak more about what external actors can do and are doing, as well as, like Mohammed mentioned, we have a lot of stories specifically from women who've been affected by GBV and sexual violence. So I'd be happy to share those whenever the time's right.
Yeah, I think this is a good segue because that was one of my questions, and maybe you could begin with it. This conflict has been referred to by one of your colleagues at CARE, actually, as a war on women. And maybe you could discuss sexual violence in this context. How pervasive is it? It's being used strategically. How can women defend themselves, basically, in this terrible context? Do you have any insights there?
Yeah, so I put one of our latest reports in the chat. This came out at the 500-day mark, which was about a month ago. And just to underline Mohammed's point earlier, this has been forgotten in a lot of ways and or ignored. And so the fact that we're 500 days into conflict and some people are just now learning about it is really a failure on the part of us as the international community. And so this report highlights, of course, displacement and hunger, which are some of the most stark facts coming out of Sudan. The amount of people displaced is staggering. And so to that point, this is the largest displacement crisis in the world, undoubtedly. 13 million people are displaced, some of them before the conflict, but it's now totaling 13 million. 10.7 million are IDPs within Sudan, which you can imagine as they're experiencing conflict, no livelihood or economic opportunities, having to flee. You can only imagine the situation for the most vulnerable, including women and children. And then 2.3 million have crossed into other countries. So I know we'll circle back to that spillover effect to neighboring countries. But what our report did is it highlighted the mental health crisis and the gender-based violence crisis in a few top lines, and then I'll share stories. Top line is 15.7 million children and their families have been impacted by the crisis in Sudan, and they might be at risk of mental disorders because of this interlinking causation between conflict and hunger. And then an estimated 1.4 million Sudanese are projected to have severe mental illness after the conflict. So even once we get food in and access, the mental health crisis is expected to last long after that, even when there might be more stability. And then on GBV, a recent study out of South Sudan showed that 65% of women in South Sudan reported experiencing intimate partner or sexual violence, which is a rate double of the global average. And so we're imagining the numbers across the border in Sudan are that high or higher given the conflict dynamics. UNFPA says 6.7 million children or million people are currently at risk of gender-based violence in Sudan. And some of the survivors we're seeing are as young as 9 years old. This is exacerbated because 80% of healthcare facilities are closed. So you can imagine these women and children are not able to get support even when they have experienced violence. And so to put it into context, here's a story. There's a woman named Jamila. She's from Khartoum State. And even before the conflict started, she had experienced some domestic violence and was divorced. But then when fighting began, things got worse. And so she tells her story saying that a group of armed men attacked her house. They took all of my belongings and assaulted me, she says. But the worst experience I encountered was when I was fleeing from Khartoum to East Darfur. I was raped by 8 armed officials on the way, and all of my belongings were looted again by these gunmen. I was then raped and beaten 3 times by thieves on the way from Khartoum to East Darfur. She says, I was so desperate and filled with guilt that I thought of committing suicide to get rid of the feelings of losing control and the disgust that shadowed me. But despite my frustration and pain, I decided to continue my journey to East Darfur. When she reached East Darfur, she met with our staff, and I know we're just one of many organizations responding. And so she got to meet our gender-based violence, or GBV, focal point. And they gave her some basic assistance, like in-kind support, so that she could at least have something to live on. And then she enrolled in one of our psychosocial support facilities. And she ended by saying, I feel a little bit better now. The generous assistance has helped me recover from my distress, but there's still a long way to go. And so that's just one woman's story. I mean, it's hard to hear, but there she faced, she was already struggling in life. And then she faced this rape by 8 different people, assaults by armed men along the way, and then also assaults by thieves, and this kind of lack of control in the security situation. And so it's really disheartening. I don't know if you're like me, but I can feel overwhelmed. And the scale of the crisis can be really stark. And yet these interventions of some psychosocial support, some in-kind support, they can go a long way in providing stability, but it's really endemic and a very large issue. So thank you, Peter, for raising that and just bringing attention to this crisis.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you for helping to personalize this tragedy. But perhaps for other panelists, Mohammed, you mentioned the sexual violence factor as well. Would you like to comment from your end, having been recently in the country?
Thank you. And yes, I mean, just like Kelly said, unfortunately, there are far too many stories like that across the country. And, Plan International has been working there since the late 70s. And I don't like bringing numbers into the conversation, because behind each and every number is actually an individual, and it is a life. It's a son, a daughter, a father, a mother, a cousin, a son-in-law, daughter-in-law, and that's really we tend to forget or overlook when we regurgitate these and these numbers rolling off our tongues very, very easily. But these numbers are, 21 million people it's the size of population. It's nearly half the size of the population of Canada, for example, that are currently, suffering and suffering because of a deliberate and crisis. I mean, the one thing we really need to understand is, yes, there is a famine. Yes, there is displacement. Yes, schools have been closed for over, coming up to 2 years now. But this has been done deliberately. And this was all preventable. And yet, we as the humanitarian and global community have, spectacularly failed Sudan in the entire response. And the question I have for people like yourselves and your esteemed audience is, why have we lost our moral compass? Because these are issues that we've read about, in medieval times, and yet we are dealing with them today in the 21st century. And yet it is continuing to happen. Right now it's happening in Sudan, tomorrow it will happen in other places, and yet all we do is just have these discussions, regurgitate these numbers, and roll our eyes and say, oh, yet another crisis in Africa. But we have to understand that the basis of this crisis is around the fact that individuals and then countries are using the suffering and of the people to their advantage, and do not really care how it's going to impact them. Because as Kelly said, even if they sign the peace agreement today, the impact it has had on the generations of Sudanese children and women and men will go on forever and ever. For at least another 40 years, people are still suffering, the shocks of the Korean War and the Vietnam War, let alone, places like Rwanda and Kosovo and the Iraq and Syria crisis. So it really is a question to the global community that why is it that we allow these atrocities to happen when, as I said, they were preventable? The famine in particular, I mean, I was there 8 months ago. We were telling the world that a famine is looming. Let us pre-position ourselves in order to save lives. And yet it fell on deaf ears. Why is it that we react only when we see dying children? I often talk about, and some of you on this call will probably recall Kevin Carter's photograph from Ethiopia with the vulture and the child. And that really triggered, and awakened the global community to respond to the catastrophe in Ethiopia back in '84. Do we need another Kevin Carter? Why do we need another Kevin Carter when we see these disasters, we see these atrocities happen far too regularly as far as I'm concerned, and far too regularly as far as the organization, plan, and many other humanitarian workers and organizations are concerned? And what is it that can be done? Because right now, the scale of the crisis, the complexity of the crisis, and the term coming up, poly-crisis, the current humanitarian architecture is not designed to address such a complex and constantly changing humanitarian crisis affecting millions of people in one country, but also impacting 7 or 8 other countries directly. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention climate change as another issue which is going to exacerbate these conflicts in the future, and it, to some extent, has already, I think, served as a causal factor, but not a single causal factor. But so I'm wondering if anyone would like to expand on that, on the climate change question. Is that having an impact here? Well, I mean, from what I'm told, it has been because of drought and other issues, but you've got drought in some areas of Africa, of course, and flooding in others, right? So we've got extreme weather going on. So that's one question I had, if anyone wanted to pick up on that. And then I did have a more specific question too, that perhaps, Khalid, you could perhaps address, because it has come up in the chat, but it was also one of my planned questions, of course. It's well known that external forces, perhaps with support from the United Arab Emirates in particular, right? And other countries are playing a role here, and maybe you could expand on this, and including the quest for gold. People have mentioned the Al Fakr Advanced Works, the Al Khalij Bank, for example, being involved. What kind of role is resource plunder having here, but also other countries and the influence that some have argued, of course, that if you could just get them to stop supplying weapons, etc., this would be part of the solution.
Thank you. Well, in terms of the issue of the climate change, I think that it's well known, Peter, I'm sure that you're aware that the Sahel region has been suffering bouts of climate change, and particularly desertification, at least since the late 1970s and 1980s. Why is that important for politics? To understand the context of the first Darfur conflict, and people always ask, why would there be such mass killings? And why would people from the regions participate in such killings? And there was always this framing, and I want to be very clear here, that was simplistic at the time. It continues to resurface, and that is that it's a tribal conflict, as in other African conflict, in this case in Darfur, between Arab tribes and African tribes. And understanding the ravages of climate change and desertification in the late 70s and 1980s in Darfur and Kurdistan, particularly in Darfur, helps us understand this very precarious and delicate relationship between different communal groups in Darfur, pastoral, agro-pastoral, and nomadic, that historically have worked very closely together. Desertification really upended all of that. And that is not to blame this war or the first Darfur war on climate change, but that it allows the context and opportunities for political actors, bad actors, particularly from the central government, to really exercise and prosecute a war, an scorched earth policy, which kind of expands the notion, what we call in political science, a contagion of fear, because all of those networks and institutions, informal and communal, break down in the context of climate change if not addressed. And so I make this point for us to understand, and I think Mohammed mentioned, and we will discuss, why this is a war in Sudan and also a war in the Sahel region. The notion and the understanding of the recruitment of the rapid support forces and the fact that they are able to recruit from the entire Sahel all the way to Niger and Mali without understanding the ravages of climate change and desertification in the Sahel and the pauperization of young men in particular, and of course communities as a whole, we cannot understand the incentives behind not only the recruitment into militias, but also their acts of savagery, looting, and even sexual assault, to be quite honest. So the issue of climate change is not theoretical, it's not just purely scientific, it's also political and humanitarian. In terms of the external actors, I think it's very important to understand, I agree with Mohammed and of course our guests from World Vision, that this is definitely a neglected humanitarian crisis. It's not, however, a neglected war. And by that I mean that looking at it exclusively as a war that's neglected by the international community obscures the reality of this war. And the reality of this war is that there are many actors that are deeply invested in and interested in this war in Sudan. And so when we look at it from a political, not exclusively humanitarian perspective, we understand that these actors, both the militia, the Sudan armed forces, have been able to sustain this awful and brutal war as a result partially and in great part because of the support of external actors. That's not a secret. It's the same across the board in all warring countries, and Sudan and this war is no exception. So, for example, in the 1980s and 1990s, there's no question that the previous regime benefited greatly from its alliances, first with the Gulf countries and initially from Iran, and later, frankly, even with the United States with respect to exchanging intelligence information, even in the context of sanctions implemented against the former regime for strategic reasons associated with the war on terrorism and the bombings in the 1990s of US embassies in Kenya, Tanzania, and the hosting of the late Osama bin Laden. So let's be very clear that external actors have from the beginning really played an important role. But to bring it home to this war, I think all Sudanese know, and observers of Sudan are well aware that you have countries that are aligned with the Sudan armed forces, historically Egypt, that prefers a military partner rather than a civilian democratic partner for a variety of reasons, has and continues to support the Sudan armed forces. In addition, in recent months, you had the support not only of Iran that has supplied drones to the Sudan armed forces, fueling, by the way, the expansion of the war in Khartoum, but also once again, the involvement of Russia, believe it or not, interested in a logistical base on the Port Sea. And that is very clear. Recently, as you know, Burhan went all the way to Beijing in the midst of the war. Here you see on one side Egypt, China, Iran, for a variety of different reasons, supporting one side. If you take a look at the other side, of course, that recently the New York Times had a very important piece just a few days ago, as you know. Declan wrote an article on the kind of evidence that he's marshaled and others with respect to the United Arab Emirates actually not only supporting financially the rapid support forces, but also under the cover of humanitarian delivery, also supporting the militia. So if you look at all of that, I think that people who do not follow Sudan regularly will see the neglect and on the humanitarian side, which is so grave. As Mohammed said, the United Nations has said, or rather MSF has said, that it is a failure of humanity given the lack of attention to the humanitarian crisis. But unfortunately, on the political sense, we have something entirely different. We have vested interest of some of the most powerful countries in the region and the world interested in the strategic location of Sudan across the Sahel and Port Sudan, and interest very much in the world's fifth largest exporter of gold and the third largest gold exporter in the African continent. 90% of that gold is smuggled to the Arab Gulf region, particularly the UAE. So when we bring all of these facts together, it is very distressing, but it also points towards potential resolution. It points to the role of these very influential, very powerful actors with respect not only in sustaining, I'm not saying causing the war for sure, but helping to play a role in sustaining it. But it also, I think, from my perspective and others, that without understanding this fully, we cannot come to an understanding of what are the elements to actually end this war and resolve the conflict. And this is what the negotiations first in March in Saudi Arabia under US auspices begin to really tackle, including the ones that were held with the African Union, later on in Bahrain, which were more promising because the two actors actually arrived, and finally the one in Geneva. So we have to follow the progression of these peace talks and try to understand, are they taking into consideration not only the domestic factors to the war, but also the role of external actors, to the point where Biden in his speech at the United Nations recently assembly, actually for the first time coming from the President of the United States, first it came from his envoy, but said very clearly that something must be done with respect to external actors, quote unquote, that are fueling the war in Sudan. Here now the world cannot turn a blind eye to the role of external actors in fueling and sustaining this war. And I think for the Sudanese population, inside and outside, we are very interested, I'm speaking as Sudanese, that those voices are heard, that the role of external actors are heard, and that the Sudanese voices, as many of whom are here on this program, begin to be heard in terms of their understanding of how this war would end and how it can be resolved. And so I'm very, very thankful to you, Peter, and everyone for giving all of us this opportunity, because I think this is something that is slowly but increasingly being taken seriously because of the spillover effect of this horrendous war.
Thank you very much. Yes, so it's a very complex web, as that's been spun here regarding external involvement. I appreciated what you said about climate as well. I think where climate change has become the superior recruitment device, if you will, for extremism around the world, and this has been an example of that. Of course, it's certainly an exacerbating factor. Yes, I would argue we're going to see more of a causal factor as things emerge. But thank you for that question. It's very complicated, as you've mentioned. And Kelly, do you see external actors playing a role here? From your end, you're looking more at the humanitarian effort.
Yeah.
The day-to-day of getting things through.
Yeah, it's complicated, right? It
Yeah.
can feel like one step forward and a few steps back. Something as simple as opening a border crossing, and it gets muddied when then there's different requirements to meet, and the bridges to actually access affected areas may or may not be functional. It's rainy season, and so there's always political layers. One thing, I work on the advocacy side, and I see Mohammed's hand. So Mohammed, I'd love for you to jump in at any point, but on the advocacy side, World Vision has support offices around the world, like France and Germany, EU, Korea, Netherlands, US. And so I've been gathering our support offices so that at least our messages to global governments can be consistent. We work closely with people like Plan, Mercy Corps, Save the Children, etc. As World Vision, our 3 advocacy pillars have been, first and foremost, some form of end of hostilities. Again, it can be very discouraging if there's any possibilities towards that, but we need to be clear that this is a conflict-induced famine and hunger situation. And so without an end to conflict, or at least a stopping of the current conflict, there really is going to be no progress forward. Again, as humanitarians, it's not our slot to say how or that should be happening, but we are trying to encourage governments to use all the leverage they can to that end. Second is humanitarian access. So we need all cross-line routes. That means within Sudan, going from staff to RSF-controlled areas and vice versa. We need to be able to use all roads and access points, and then also all cross-border activities. This is where it gets complicated because so our third point then is funding. And so these complicate each other. There's lack of funding, not only for the response inside Sudan, but also the regional response and the refugees who fled outside of Sudan. And so we see that in Chad, where Sudanese who fled to the Chadian side of the border, there's stories of children having to raid anthills to get the little grain that the ants have stored up so that their family have something to eat. And that's a terrible situation for them to be in. And so us bringing food from that side into Sudan can cause communal tensions, rightly so, because there's needs on both sides. And so we really need the regional response funded as well as in the country. So again, our 3 pillars have been cessation of hostilities, access, and funding, but there's so much more that we can advocate for. So Mohammed, I don't know if you wanted to jump in on that.
Yeah, please.
No, thank you, Kelly. Yes, I mean, those we collectively have been raising over the crisis back in April. But I'd just like to come back to a point that Khalid was making. And the one thing that we feel in Plan that is lacking with some extremely articulate who are not part of the peace negotiations, who are not part of schools, whether it's talks in Jeddah, Bahrain, elsewhere. We have seen this happen over and over again. Colombia, when women start talking about peace and reconciliation, start to happen. And it is high time that women are able to discuss issues around cessation of hostility, how best to reach the most vulnerable and humanitarian efforts. Those of you who were involved in the Afghanistan war and the crisis there, program of getting grandmothers to talk to the men and their it is the role of the Sudanese women, I feel, that needs to be further of the discussion and dialogue when it comes to not just peace agreements and peace response as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mohammed. You were in and out a bit there, but I think we were able to follow what you were saying and the urgent need to elevate women's voices in Sudan. And Kelly, it looks like you've got something you wanted to add to that.
Well, I'm going to add something about women's voices in Sudan that's a little bit subjective, but I think Sudanese will understand, and that is that in many ways this is a war against women and was a war against women from the beginning. And the reason for that is very simple. The revolution of late December of 2018 and 2019 had an inordinate, disproportionate amount of women at the forefront. For a variety of historical reasons, including their subjugation in law and in practice by the former regime. That level of mobilization against a regime, not only to liberate women, but elsewhere with women participating so much, basically positioned women with respect to both the generals of the Sudan Armed Forces and the militia as a threat to their interest. Not just a peripheral threat, but a central threat to their political standing and their legitimacy. That really helps us understand a variety of things, a couple of things. One of them, of course, is the virulent attack against women, not only in terms of sexual violence and assault, but also in terms of incarceration, imprisonment, and also torture of women political prisoners, which is very, very important. It also, unfortunately, as Mohammed mentioned, helps us understand why women, as opposed to the case of Liberia, for example, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, where women played a central role in ceasefire and conflict resolution, why have Sudanese women been excluded, even though they have been historically so mobilized against authoritarianism and these kind of wars? And here is where people are working very hard and should work very hard to include women as part of these negotiations for the ceasefire, not only in terms of just representation, but in order for women to set the agenda. If you look at the consultations of the US envoy with women in Geneva and before, and you read what Sudanese women have put in terms of how to stop the war and what should come after, you would be thoroughly impressed. Kelly, I think, would be aware that their focus really is on humanitarian access, not just on a ceasefire. Their focus really on supporting first responders. Their focus really is on supporting emergency response rooms, which are the local institutions that support organizations like the one Kelly works with. So women are not just about representation. It's not about the right thing to do. It is that they actually are peacemakers and have proven to be the case in other African contexts. So it's what Mohammed said, I think, is really central. If you don't mind me saying, we have a number of Sudanese women listening right now. I know a couple of them who are working tirelessly as Sudanese Canadian women in order to make sure the role of women are heard and not peripheral, but central. So they've actually been very, very effective, not only in lobbying governments, but in Canada, they have been the lead. I'm in Canada too, but I don't mind saying they have been the lead in working to support Sudanese refugees. They have been the lead in helping the Canadian government try to strategize about what to do about Sudan. So it's, I'm just going to put it out there as a reality, if you don't mind me saying.
Yeah, thank you. And I should add, we did have Nimata Madi, who you might know. She's the founder and the president of Darfur Women Action Group. She was scheduled to join us, but I don't think she's been able to make the call. If she is, then she should introduce herself in the chat because we can. No, I don't think she's made it. Okay. And I was looking forward to hearing from her because, yes, I'm vaguely aware. This has been very educational for me, actually, this last intervention, these last few interventions, in terms of the role that women have played, the specific efforts to oppress them during this, given the historical context. That's very interesting. But also the possible positive role, right, that they could play, even under these trying circumstances. So this is very educational on my end. I mean, I think we're moving towards a more concentrated discussion, perhaps, than on solutions, on possibilities. And I'm very curious to hear from all of you. And one way to frame this is, might be, as a Canadian, speaking from Canada, if I have dinner with the Prime Minister tomorrow, it's not scheduled, but who knows, what do I tell him, right? What can we do about Sudan? How can we overcome the tendency to frankly, the public eye has overlooked this terribly. There's no question. That's what motivated me to put this panel together. And obviously the other conflicts that are raging right now deserve attention, and rightly so. But to get this into the public eye, and panels like this can help, but let's be honest, what we need are politicians to start talking, I think, right? What would you have me say to, or what would you say yourself to the Canadian leadership? And I'd really like to hear from all three of you on this, in terms of what Canada in particular can do in this situation, or a country similar, of course, to Canada, similar in size and resource capability. I don't know who would want to go first with that. Open it up. Mohammed, would you? Or sorry, yeah. Khalid, sounds like you're ready to go.
I'm always ready to go.
Ready to go. Good.
Well, to be quite honest, Peter, I've been asked this question a lot among Canadian interviewers and journalists, and the question, and this is where I would like to bring in Mohammed and Kelly and you yourself, because I think this is a question I can point to, but it's also, frankly, I'm curious what the Canadian point of view is. I've been here for many years, but I'm Sudanese and an American citizen. Don't blame me for that, I hope. But the reason that I mentioned that is that from my perspective, the soft power that Canada has, and this is what I usually tell people in Ottawa, is not one that America or Europe wields, of course, and not the Gulf countries. Canada worldwide has a soft power that has, as you know, framed its role and influence in terms of humanitarianism and liberal humanitarianism. It is something that has been critiqued by Canadians themselves as masking from other agenda. But the truth of the matter, I think, for the Canadian public, there is a general attachment and identification with a foreign policy that takes seriously humanitarianism. And I think that it's both good for humanitarian issues like the ones Kelly and Mohammed work on, but I think it's good for Canada as well. I mean, many people have come to Canada or think of Canada in those terms. That itself is what we call in America, in political science, soft power, which can be extremely influential for a variety of different reasons. We can talk about its critique in another way. So I think Canada historically has been very good at framing humanitarian interventions. I have worked with students for many years on that who are now in global affairs, and I know that they're really interested in that because they self-identify with it. And they believe that that is Canadian. I think that there may be other interests behind that, so I think it's really important. Another element is to understand seriously that Sudanese are Canadians who are here. And if you don't mind me saying, the Sudanese diaspora, and I'm speaking for them here because they've asked me to sometimes, and that is issues of helping Sudanese refugees and asylum seekers has stalled. After much work of the Sudanese diaspora working towards allowing for humanitarian pathways for Sudanese, no one is asking the Canadian government to bring 27 million Sudanese to Canada, but people have been dying waiting for processing. I mean, it's getting to that level. Not one Canadian, a Sudanese family has benefited from reunification or these pathways. The financial barriers are very strict, and they're also discriminatory if you compare them to other policies with respect to, for example, Ukrainians and people from Latin America. And if you don't mind me saying, Sudanese Canadians as a Muslim, African, and Arab population also represent a really wide swath of the Canadian community. And so we would like to see, and the Sudanese Canadian diaspora is working tirelessly and would like to see some relief for not all of Sudan, but relief for Sudanese Canadian families. That is Sudanese who carry Canadian citizenship and are permanent residents. And I think that that's not too much to ask. So there's a domestic policy thing to work on. And also I think that there is an intervention on humanitarian angle. I think Canada is far more qualified to push for humanitarian exposure of the crisis, to model and design what the international community can do, because what Kelly is describing, what Mohammed is describing, are bureaucratic and political blockages in Sudan, the food and aid being used as a weapon. I'm not going to rehearse that for Kelly. She knows exactly what I'm talking about. But this is where Canada has the experience. And that has to be part and parcel of the negotiations. Canada would have been a really great asset to the Geneva talks where actors did not understand that opening up a border for 3 months in Chad by a government that does not actually control that border is not really humanitarian access. So, we really need Canada to really come forward and say, we've got the experience in terms of humanitarianism. We have worked in all of these countries in Africa and elsewhere, and we want to be part of the design and implementation of humanitarian intervention.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic answer, I think. And Canada's reputation as, well, we'll throw peacekeepers into the mix. That doesn't solve all problems, right? And this is clearly far too complex for that. I'd like to come back a bit to that, though, about possible peacekeeping operations. But Kelly or Mohammed, did you have anything to add to make Canadians try to get a bit more animated on this issue?
Go for it, Mohammed.
Thank you, Kelly. I mean, as a fellow Canadian, would be an interesting conversation at the current situation of the politics in Canada. But now I made a number of points that Khalid made, and for me, it's done it in the past. I mean, when we had leadership in the Foreign Office and leading the Foreign Ministry, he brought gravitas, and he brought and clearly showed Canada's position globally.
Sorry to interrupt, Mohammed, but you're in and out. But who are you referring to?
Lloyd Axworthy.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. We missed the name. Yes, I thought so, though. Yeah.
And so, for me, it's important that we regain our space. I mean, we are seen as an honest broker, or had been seen as an honest broker, and we really need to regain that space. Khalid bringing the issue of the Adre crossing, the 3 months it coincides with the rainy season. So opening the Adre crossing, and then knowing that trucks and lorries will not be able to cross because of the rains is again a bureaucratic administrative. We need to understand that. We need to call a spade a spade.
Mm-hmm.
Did so in the past and can regain that space today. Commitment, putting in more aid money into the funding to humanitarian players around the world, to Canadian organisations, I think will put us in a very. That's what I would tell the Prime Minister if and when I have.
Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, I mean, if back to Lloyd Axworthy, responsibility to protect human security as an animating foreign policy imperative, you know, I'm getting back to that. One would hope that it's things like this that might push us there. On the other hand, more realistically, as you said, Mohammed, internal political developments in Canada, I fear we're going the other way. But sorry, Kelly, did you have something else to add?
Yeah, I was just going to mention, I threw in the chat a statement from the Sudan INGO, International NGO Forum this week that was published on the sidelines of UNGA for the world leaders. And so it has some specific asks there that you might find interesting around, you know, unhindered, unimpeded humanitarian access, which we've been talking about, strengthening diplomacy on conflict-induced hunger, and then flexible funding. And to the flexible funding piece, Rania has been posting in the chat. She really interestingly brought up the question of local NGOs and some of the access that they have, but also how can we get funding to them, the ones that are responding. And I know the emergency rooms have already been mentioned. That and other Sudanese local and national organizations truly are the ones responding in areas where international staff can't be, or even most of our staff with World Vision, the 200, are Sudanese, but still for an international NGO, we have benefits of we can get some global funding, the reporting, things like that we're really good on, because a lot of global funding is really hard to pass down to these local actors. And so partnerships are so important for us. But I think there can also be a lot more advocacy in these global capitals, Canada included, to have governments take on a bit more of a risk appetite in actually funding local Sudanese organizations that are in the country and responding where others can't be. And so I do think that's an interesting angle. But then again, there's more kind of action points in this joint statement that has been reviewed by many different NGOs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, wonderful. And just back on, or still on solutions then, is there any hope for an African intervention? The African Union has a complicated situation here, I know, but is there any hope there, or that support for the African Union could help overall? I know this is complicated. I don't expect a long, detailed answer, but what you'll get from a lot of people in North America, perhaps even Europe, is, well, it's an African problem. Let Africa solve it. Now, I realize, of course, right, that's a very simplistic perspective. Don't get me wrong. But I'm just wondering if there's any credence to the idea that the African Union can play a bigger role. I know there's been some efforts. Elliot, perhaps you could expand on that, knowing the geopolitics of the region so well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a disillusionment with respect to the African Union, primarily because it's not just a lack of resources, but suspicions that certain countries have vested interest in one party or another. In particular, Sudan Armed Forces has done everything that it can to exclude the participation of the African Union. Remember, the African Union continues to not consider the Sudan Armed Forces and the Burhan government as legitimate because, believe it or not, the African Union has a clause against military coups that overthrow, civilian transitions or democracies. And so for that reason, the Sudan Armed Forces generals have been intent on trying to legitimize themselves as a legitimate government. And they've accused the African Union of siding with the Rapid Support Forces militias. And this is the main reason that they've stalled, the talks have stalled. But to answer your question directly, and I'm going to answer it as someone who teaches these things, is that there is absolutely, from my perspective, and I said this from the beginning of the war, no other real option for a couple of reasons. The African Union represents countries, particularly in its IGAD formation, the regional bloc of IGAD in the Horn of Africa and East Africa. It represents two important things. Number one, things that other actors do not possess, and one of them is a real vested interest in stability. A real and a vested interest in stability and the kind of insecurity that this war has brought to the entire region, including South Sudan, for example. We can talk about that as well. So that's very important. Another issue is sustainability. Regional countries are the ones who actually sustain ceasefires and peace processes over time. And we see that in other African situations. The notion of Africans helping themselves has always been the case. I know people don't really kind of always understand, but wars in Africa have ended, and mostly by regional African actors to sustain the process. This includes Liberia, for example, and even Rwanda. And so the role of the African Union is essential, it's central. From here, as I said previously, months ago, at the beginning of the war, even to people in Ottawa, that does not mean the African Union does not need financial, logistical, and most importantly, political support from the powerful countries like Canada and the US. And that becomes important. And finally, the reason it's important that the African Union is also a balance against the Arab Union and the Arab regional bloc. Sudan, as you know, is distinguished in geopolitical terms by its relationship both to the Africa region and the Arab region. And the African Union is essential because over time, it's the only one that really has a balance. The only one that can balance this. All of that to say, many of us have been speaking about this from the beginning of the war. And if you see the negotiations, the Americans have taken it to heart. I know that for a fact. I've spoken to some of them before their Geneva talks. And that is that you begin with the Saudi Arabian talks in Jeddah, you move then to Bahrain, and then finally in Geneva, actually, lo and behold, the African Union is invited as part and parcel of the discussions. Here, there is an understanding slowly, but very importantly, that both the very important Arab neighbors like Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates must be included, but they must be included with the African Union. Those two regional blocs are the only ways, only avenues to bring a ceasefire and eventually a resolution to the war.
Okay, thank you. We haven't really talked about justice yet, and we don't have time to do it justice, the theme. But of course, there's a long history of the International Criminal Court being involved with the indictment of al-Bashir and so forth. I'm wondering, if we can just give ourselves for a moment the luxury of thinking about a post-conflict Sudan. What sort of justice mechanisms could be enforced, and especially when it comes to the war on women that we've discussed. Do we think that there's a possibility that the International Criminal Court will be involved in this? I know that they're talking about it, obviously. Or should justice be more of a Sudanese endeavor? I'll put it that way. And I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, Kelly or Mohammed, or we'll give Khaled a brief break before I come back to him.
Go ahead, Kelly. You tackle that question.
That's a tough question. Again, as a humanitarian, that's a bit out of my scope. So I can just say we are here trying to respond. And I think, more attention is coming as some of these reports of famine conditions come out, but the international community loses attention very quickly. And so what I'm concerned about is not just, the immediate life-saving, food assistance, etc. We're really pushing for that to be cash assistance so that markets can remain as much as possible. But what I'm really concerned about is the way global trends are going. Humanitarian aid is a bit protected, but development aid is getting cut drastically. And it's that sort of aid that will help build resilience and come alongside the community, whatever things look like. On the justice point, I'll let my colleagues take that because that is a tall order, but very important.
Absolutely. You can't do transitional justice on the cheap. Right, and it's going to be part of a broader development plan, obviously. And so, unless you had anything you wanted to say specifically on that topic, we can move on because we're running short on time.
Well, I have to say that that is a. Sorry, Mohammed, did you want to? I can't see Mohammed from here.
Yeah, I mean, on the justice part, I think it's critical, but I would start from not just from the the ICG level, but I would start justice from because of the nature of this crisis and how it has split the country up in many and fragmented the population. Justice needs to start from the communities itself. That's where the core element needs to start looking at, what went wrong, why did it go wrong in our neighborhood, and that's where it has to start from. It's the Sudanese have to look at themselves first and foremost and see, why did we create such a vulnerability that other actors took advantage of, and from there it needs to be built up. So the justice question needs to start from the core, and the core are the people of Sudan. Thank you.
Khalid, briefly?
Sure. In the course of the revolution, the civilian political parties, I'm going to abridge this very quickly, decided to postpone the issue of justice for pragmatic reasons, quote unquote. Like you said, and people believe, justice is a luxury when you're transitioning from a military to civilian regime. That had proven to be horribly one of the most fateful decisions that the civilian government, in partnership with the military and the international community, decided to undertake, because there was a lack of understanding that not understanding the issue of justice and taking it seriously meant there was very little interest in law and order institutions, which are so weakened. That's number one. Number two, justice, and I interviewed Sudanese young people many times during that period, and for them the issue of justice was the central one. In other words, for them, more important than anything was the issue of justice. So here we're talking about not only pragmatism, law and order institutions, but we're also talking about legitimacy, that no transition can go forward without that kind of legitimacy. And finally, Peter, as you put it, the Sudanese population had already reached a consensus on transnational justice, both in the framework agreement that was aborted on purpose, and prior to that with respect to the young people's programs and charters. So it's all there on paper: transitional justice, security sector reform, and the importance of law and order. This is one of the reasons this war occurred. So we're talking about the importance of this justice issue is important because that's one of the reasons why these protagonists went to war, in order to stop the wave and the momentum of that happening. So we have to return to that, because in every single transition in a post-conflict situation, as Kelly and all of the humanitarians know very well, the issue of transitional justice has been central, whether it's in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Rwanda. Rwanda is a wonderful case, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's impossible to start from a clean slate. The past lives with us, and if there isn't efforts made towards justice, then it's not forgotten, as you pointed out so eloquently. Okay, I just wanted to say that I want to thank everyone for the comments that they've made in the chat. We had hoped to use the Q&A, but I don't think there's much point going there now, because I don't think it's been used. But in the chat, those of you that are able to follow, and we have recorded this event, so we're hoping to distribute it to a wider audience. But there's a lot of really interesting things in the chat, including a recent intervention from one of our audience, IA. I don't know who that is, but anyways. But they're stressing the importance of the health impacts of this conflict, the health system, the importance of getting it back up and running again as soon as possible, and that there is a Sudan Doctors Union in Canada that's been working with colleagues at the front line to boost the response, and there's a link there. I've noticed also that some people are even putting their email addresses in the chat, and that's wonderful. Anything this can do to bring the community together. Not everyone's going to agree on everything, obviously, and we're seeing a bit of that too. But just to get the discussion moving, I think, is the important thing. That's what really counts here. And I know I apologize on behalf of Canadians everywhere that this discussion's not moving the way it should be. Right? That this isn't front page news every day, given the extent of the catastrophe unfolding. So we are in a bit short of time, so I'd really like to give each of our panelists one more opportunity for any concluding thoughts they have, any message that they'd like to leave us with tonight. So I think, Khalid, we started with you, so let's go back. Any concluding thoughts that you'd like to leave us with?
I think I've said so many different points, but I would like to say that, first of all, in this particular case, I prefer to speak as a Sudanese, and to say that these kind of panels are absolutely vital. I happen to feel that there is a great interest with the Canadian population. If you Google me, you'll see why. There is there's a disconnect between the Canadian population and their interest and lack of knowledge, and other, kind of distractions that the political class is dealing with. And so here, just as we talk about Sudanese civil society, I think it would be great to talk about Canadian civil society and what their priorities are. I think that the more exposure to this conflict, the more interest there is, and the more support that there is. I know that to be the fact. So what I said, I'd like to conclude by putting that question out there as someone who's a bit of an outsider, and say, is this a priority to Canadian civil society? If it's not, that's also okay as well. I mean, every society has its interests. But I think that for Canadians of whatever background, is the notion of humanitarianism an essential part of what it is to be Canadian, an essential part of Canada in the world. Is it of interest? I know America very well. I can tell you how complicated that is. And I would even argue that issues of power and interest are more important among the American population for a variety of reasons, as proud as I am to be from that country as well. But my question is, Sudanese are asking in Canada, is that what Canada stands for, what Canadians feel is important, what makes them feel good about their identity, their citizenship, their residency, their relationship to the world. And so I'd like to just conclude with that.
Thank you. And I think that's a question we should all take with us, definitely, and ponder, especially as we enter an election cycle of our own. Okay. Mohammed, did you have any closing comments you'd like to make?
Sure. Thank you, Peter, for this opportunity. And my closing comments would be, that more needs to be done for Sudan today and tomorrow. And then once the peace is achieved, the whole reconstruction and development and redevelopment of Sudan will need a concerted effort by the global community. It is a global crisis that needs global effort, and Canada should and can play a leading role in bringing this forward. And I feel that we haven't done enough, and we as a nation that prides itself on human rights and prides itself on the rights of women and children, should do and can do a lot more for Sudan and other countries around Sudan who are suffering because of the crisis. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, and thank you so much for staying up long past my bedtime in where you are in Nairobi. Kelly, any last comments?
Yeah, nothing new. I'm so encouraged, even seeing in the chat the efforts all of you have, some of you have already been making, is really incredible to see. And I know there's so much I could learn from so many of you. I would end on kind of echoing my co-panelists' points, that there is hope. There is so much hope. Please continue doing what you're doing. Please reach out to your, colleagues and others here on the call to find ways to get involved. And I think everything matters. Like we shared, there's so many stories of individuals. And yes, I think Mohammed was bringing up the numbers are staggering, and yet a little aid can go a long way. A little advocacy etc. And so thank you, Peter, for hosting this conversation. I know it's a step in the right direction, and thank you all for listening and participating in this. It's really cool to see the engagement.
Okay, so thanks so much for our panelists, and thanks so much for all the audience here. I hope we can keep the conversation going. Silence is death when it comes to mass catastrophes like this. So let's keep talking, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you.
Everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.